Today I've got Harv Nagra on the show. Harv is an agency operations consultant, a former in-house agency operations director, and the head of brand communications at agency work management platform Scoro. He's also the host of the fabulous podcast, The Handbook, the Agency Operations Podcast. So you know when that's the name of the show, we've got an expert here. So Harv, a big warm welcome.
Thank you so much, Jenny. It's a pleasure to be here.
Great. Well, Harv, we've had a little bit of a chat before the podcast, and I'm really curious to try to ask as many relevant questions for the audience as it comes to getting their operations sorted. Now, you introduced me to the concept of the business maturity model, which I
Mhm.
think is a fabulous way to kind of paint a picture of all the aspects of operations. So, what is a business maturity model, and why is it useful for an agency?
That's a great question. So, a business maturity model is a really useful tool for agency management, whether you're the MD, you're the ops director, or senior level leadership, to understand where you're at in terms of your operational maturity. This is something, Jenny, I was introduced to years ago when I was making the move into an operational role. My then boss, the COO, introduced me to it and said, have a look and try to figure out where you think we're at. And it was really eye-opening for me. And it gave me a really nice benchmark for where we're at today and where we might want to go. And I think if you don't have a reference, it can be really hard to figure out what's next. And, is this good enough or is there more that we should be doing? So I think it really gives you a steer. There's loads of maturity models out there. They tend to have about 5 stages, and there's different ones for different sectors and industries. The one I tend to reference quite a bit is the SPI research, service maturity levels. Agencies, consultancies, we are service-based businesses, even if we don't use that language very often. So that model, I think, works well. And like I said, it's just a nice shorthand reference for where you're at and where you should be going.
I think it's that's such a good point actually, and I'd never heard of that. So thank you for sharing, and I'm sure everyone's sort of googling it. But
Hmm.
it's also like you say, it's good to have a framework, isn't it? Because operations, I mean, I believe it's the engine room of the agency, and in order
Hmm.
to operate a tool, you need to put operations at the heart of your system. So if you don't have any kind of reference point, like you said, or benchmark or framework,
Hmm.
then it's difficult to kind of assess and audit how we've how are we performing when it comes to operations. So would you mind walking us through the actual business maturity model, because I think it's, having sort of had a quick look at it, it's, I think it's going to be super helpful.
Hmm. Absolutely. And Jenny, like today, I think what I'd like to focus on is looking at it through the lens of like process and systems and tools and that kind of thing. But I just so we don't turn this into a 3-hour podcast session, but it does apply to things like leadership, client relationships, talent, and service execution as well, and beyond, finance and ops. But again, we'll go through it through a slightly narrower lens, which I think hopefully your audience will still really, really appreciate. And before we get started as well, a bit of a tangent. The labels that a lot of these maturity models use, I find them a bit jargony and hard to relate to. So forgive me, but I've taken a nod from Taylor Swift and use eras. I just think it makes it a little bit easier to understand. So bear with me as we go through that. Okay. Um,
Great.
Okay, so let's see. Stage one. So this is what I call the chaotic era, or what SPI research would call initiated. So maybe you can see why I don't love those titles. So the chaotic era, this tends to be the early years. And apologies for the siren in the background. Is that annoying or?
Tiny, yeah, tiny, don't worry, don't worry.
Okay, so let me just start that again in case you want to clip that out. Okay, so stage one is what I would call the chaotic era, or what SPI research calls initiated. This is usually the early years of your agency. So the focus, understandably, Jenny, is you want to make money and prove that your business has legs. So that's where all the focus on is on, and business leaders tend not to be so concerned about about operational consistency and best practice. So everything tends to be a bit ad hoc, everything's a bit reactive, everything's a bit made up on the fly, lots of spreadsheets flying around. And the tools that you're using to run your business will be all over the place. You might be using a bit of this, trying that, and somebody else has signed up for something else. And so I think what this means is that reporting on a project level is very difficult because there's just not any best practice. You might not be tracking your projects at all. And if you're not tracking your projects, like forget about overall business financial performance management. So it's just a bit like finger in the air, and you end up looking at your bank account and hope that your outgoings um, are less than what you're bringing in, right? So, again, loads of overservicing and scope creep because you're not really tracking how things are doing.
Can I just
Um,
can I just say, Harv, there's
yeah,
probably some people out there with more of a mature business, but thinking, oh, there's a
yep,
little bit of truth. Maybe I'm in the chaotic stage, and this is only one of five stages. So
exactly.
very
Exactly
useful.
right. And
Yeah.
and Jenny, that reminds me also. I know not to name any names, but I know businesses that are, past their first decade and they might still be operating that way. So that is concerning. So I'm not consulting for them, but just to say that, I say it could be the early years of the business, and that might be the reality, but it really depends on the people running it. If they choose never to get to that stage, they might be in that chaotic era for a very long time.
I'm sure
All
there
right.
are.
So shall we move into stage two?
Yes.
Okay, cool. So SPI would call this piloted. I call it the glimmer of growth era. Okay. So this is all about best practice being available in pockets of the organization, but not across the organization. And it really comes down to people. So I remember this years ago. I joined as digital producer, which is, digital project management role at an agency. And my tendency, my nature is to create order and structure. And when there's not, I get stressed. So it was like, okay, well, this agency is very much in that stage one. Everyone's kind of doing their own thing, but at least on our team, these are the tools we're going to use, and this is how we're going to work. So we started creating best practice for ourselves. So what ended up happening is that our business unit, the digital team, ended up working in a much more mature and consistent way than the rest of the organization. That's good, but it's not great because everyone else, once you get past those borders of the digital team, things start getting really messy again. So at this stage, attempts start being made at standardizing things, but still a lot of reactivity to where the way the business is working. There's still poor or no documentation and consistency. And because of that, and you might recognize this, Jenny, at places you've worked with or worked consulted for and stuff, you end up learning from who you sit down next to when you start. Right. And I hate that. As an ops person, I don't like that. I want documented best practice. So people are reading what I am saying is best practice rather than hearing the bad habits of who they're sitting next to. And at
That's
this stage, when you are learning from who you're sitting next to, it is really hoping for the best because they might be somebody that's very ordered and knows how it's done, or they might be teaching you all their bad habits. So it just creates this legacy of bad practice.
I can really resonate. Can I just say one thing? Because I mean,
Absolutely.
what was coming up in my mind was the times that I've worked in agencies where people are working on stuff, but sharing their work on their desktop rather
Mm,
than in some centralized
absolutely.
server, which
Yeah.
seems bizarre to say that. And these were in more mature businesses.
Yeah.
And you think, I mean, you're just creating an immediate problem, aren't you? So
Exactly.
are there any other examples of being at that glimmer of growth stage? Any other symptoms?
Yeah, I think there tends to be like inconsistency, I would say, even on time tracking and stuff like that. So you might start bringing in kind of more. I don't know if entry level is the right word, but tools like that, like Harvest, for example, that allow you to create your invoices or track your time. But there might, there's bad practice. So it means I remember a place that I used to work with. It was the same agency at the time where certain account managers would start their projects in Harvest so they would be available for time tracking, and others would be very late to converting their project. So when the designers, developers, project managers went to track their time, it was just not set up. So then it was like, okay, well, now I need to message this person to say, can you set this up? But people start expecting that to happen. So it becomes very likely that people don't bother tracking their time because they just assume, well, it's not going to be set up. And again, if only a handful of people are tracking their time on a handful of projects, well, then honestly, what's the point? What is the point? If not everyone's doing it consistently on every project, then, having one designer do a timesheet on one project isn't going to tell you very much.
Can I just, before we move on to the other stages, can I just ask you a question, your thoughts on this? Because again, this comes up a lot actually in conversations about it's not that we don't have a time tracking system and everyone knows what a timesheet is and how to do it. It's just they don't. They just
Mm-hmm.
don't do it.
Mm-hmm.
So, do you have any kind of insight or
Mm-hmm.
advice for those agency owners that are perhaps banging their heads against the wall, thinking everyone knows what to do, they're just not doing it and they're not doing it consistently? And I don't particularly want to get my, big stick out and start,
Yeah.
shouting at people.
Absolutely. This is something I had to face when we moved that agency on to its next stages as well. And I think it really comes down to educating people. We can assume that because we all work in agencies, everyone knows why it's important. But I think it's really important to emphasize that. So, shaking your stick and saying, do your timesheets. Well, it's like, you want better salaries, you want better equipment, you want a nicer office, you want social activities and drinks and lunch ordered and all this kind of stuff. That's what you want. But if we can't see if we're profitable, how can we afford to invest in your training and your fun and your equipment? So really helping people understand that this is why. It's not about tracking you and saying, "Oh, you're not productive enough and we're going to come shake a stick at you." Ultimately, if you as a designer or developer have nothing to work on, that's not your fault. That's the agency not having enough work in the pipe. So that's not going to be a problem if you don't have enough work. But we need to track how you're doing on those projects or how much time we're spending on projects so we can make sure they're profitable and so that we can measure the performance of the agency. So I would say education is a huge piece of that.
I love what you've just said, actually. There's two big points. One is what's the impact of us not doing it, which is lack of profit, which means,
Hmm.
we can't give you the training opportunities. We can't provide the equipment, salaries, etc., which is a really good tip. But but secondly, you also said something important there, which was about the reassurance we give to people. This is not our way of thinking. If you're not working on anything, you're going to lose your job because, let's be honest, a lot of people might think that,
Hmm.
but it's giving that reassurance. It's our problem if you don't have enough work to work on. So I do think that that's also important. So thank you for sharing. That's really useful.
Absolutely. So I think we're ready to move on from the glimmers of growth to the consolidated era. Okay, so SPI research would call this deployed, but yeah, let's look at it as consolidated. So this is where I think things start looking really good. Best practice has been documented and centralized, leading to consistent ways of working across the organization. Okay, so better employee training rather than learning from who you sit down next to, you're learning from that central handbook on how everything is done in the agency. So I love that. You start bringing in more mature tools which consolidate your data and integrate better with other platforms. So things aren't just sitting in silos or sitting in spreadsheets, and then you are expected to figure out how that links to that timesheet platform, to that scheduling software. So things are starting to speak together. um, Less manual movement of data means more accuracy and more efficiency, right? So you can bring in tools as well for that. You can. I don't want to go too much on this tangent, but like you can design a great system by getting everything to interface with one another. So there are ways to achieve that, but there's also tools out there that combine your quoting, your time tracking, your invoicing, your project management all in one place. Those are called professional services automation tools. So something like that. allows you to work consistently, and also starts giving you really good data. So your team can be more accountable and see how their projects are running, how much budget they have left, and things like that. So I think in this stage, performance starts getting measured and reported really
Mm.
well, but the data you're getting could be better leveraged. Okay, so you're starting to become data driven, but maybe you're still looking at how things happened until now rather than where you're going to be in 2 months. Relying too much on like lagging indicators rather than leading indicators, things like that. But again, if you get to this stage, it's a huge achievement, and I think you should pat yourself on the back.
Can I pause you there again? Because I'm sure people listening to this might be thinking, oh, that's a really good point. We've got sort of multiple systems, and
Hmm.
either we'd like to look at integrating them together,
Hmm.
or we might be in the market for looking for a one-stop shop
Hmm.
that can do everything. Do
Hmm.
you have any advice for
Hmm.
the types of platforms or names of platforms that
Hmm.
would be considered at this stage?
I can tell you a really quick story, Jenny. If I go on too long, interrupt me. But there was a stage at my past agency where we were using a lot of disjointed tools, and it was kind of in that chaotic or glimmers of growth kind of stage. And we decided we needed a change, and we had multiple entities. We had a business in France, Switzerland, and the UK, and everyone had a different system. So, you'd have to log into the UK system to do all this stuff. And if I wanted to use a French resource, it was like, well, you need to log into theirs and do a timesheet on theirs. And that was just never going to work. So we needed something that would centralize this stuff. So we brought in one of these professional services automation platforms. The one we brought in had a terrible user experience, but it did everything we needed it to do. And at the time, it was the only one I had found that did the multi-entity and the multi-currency work that we needed to do. So we went with it, even though the interface wasn't great. There was a huge leap in maturity for our business. People moaned about the user experience, and I didn't blame them. But for me, it was very much like saying, well, here's how you use it. I'm sorry, but you just need to put on your blinders for a bit and just focus on the buttons you need to click on, and forget the rest. And it's similar to when we use PowerPoint or Word. There's 1,000 buttons on that screen, but you end up using the 10 that you need to use,
Yeah.
right? So that was just the way I had to get our team to use it. So it worked, but thankfully, we lucked out. That business decided to shut down that platform and move people to a new one. And we decided, you know what, we're not sticking with this. So we went back to the drawing board and ended up finding this platform called Scoro, which I actually now work for because I loved it so much. So that's maybe a separate story, which, feel free to ask me about a bit later. But it had the beautiful user experience, and it did everything we wanted to do. And so now we were running multiple businesses, France, Switzerland, and the UK, multi-currency. Everyone was using it consistently. And yeah, it just gave us the results. So I think this is a fantastic way that any growing agency will, I think everyone at some point gets to a stage where they will benefit from one of these platforms. And you can resist that for a while and try to use the disjointed stuff as long as you can. And I understand it does take some thinking to move into one of these consolidated platforms, because you want to really think about, how are we pricing? It's an opportunity to kind of tidy things up. What are
Mm.
our price lists and rates, and how do we want to charge for stuff? And does that need to change, or are we happy with the way things are working? And what reports do we want to look at? So that you need to take the time to think about that kind of stuff. But once you move into it, I think it really unlocks your kind of future. It's like having a really good operating system running your agency.
Right. I'm just going to pause you there because I didn't expect you to actually say Scoro at that point. We didn't even have Scoro on the question sheet.
Exactly. Yeah.
But this is what I call, and you're probably too young to remember this, but your Victor Kayam moment.
Okay.
There was an ad, and
Okay.
because you're Canadian, maybe you didn't see it,
Yeah.
but there was this ad running, and oh, he was American.
Hmm.
And I don't know, the ad was, oh, I was so impressed with what they did. I bought the company. And
Hmm.
you kind of said the same thing. I was so
Hmm.
impressed with Scoro that I ended up working for them,
Hmm.
which is a huge testament to them and what,
Hmm.
what it's achieved. I mean, before we
Yeah.
move on, while we're talking about Scoro, because maybe people are in that mode of thinking about it,
Hmm.
can you give us perhaps like three of the key things that Scoro does
Hmm.
that perhaps is superior to an alternative,
Hmm.
just for them to kind of think about?
Yeah. I'm going to be a bit biased, Jenny. Like, coming from a design background, marketing background, and user experience. I used to be the digital director, right? So it was about creating beautiful digital experiences for customers. What I often find quite frustrating is a lot of these tools. They have quite terrible interfaces. So I just don't get that. You're going after agencies and design businesses and marketing businesses that are used to doing really beautiful work for their customers, but your interface looks like it was designed in like 1999. So how do you get away with that? Like there's just no justification for it. So people may disagree with me, but I think user experience is really important to me. There was this, I can't remember the name of the study, but there was this research done at one point where these researchers had two ATM, like bank machines. They had the exact same buttons, placement, and everything, but one had a really ugly interface design, and the other one was presented as really beautiful. And they asked people to test which one was easier to use. Everyone said the beautiful one was easier to use. And if your team is going to spend a lot of their day between Outlook or Gmail or and the other one is their project management software, then you want it to be a good experience, and you don't want to do what we had to do at my previous PSA platform, the one that got discontinued, where people were just constantly moaning about, oh, this is too hard and there's too many buttons to press. So I think that stands out. User experience stands out. Okay. And then the other thing I think to remember with these kind of tools that you might manage an agency with, there's a distinction between work and project management versus kind of including the financial elements. So there's tools out there that will let you manage your project really well. For example, an Asana, and there's loads out there, right? And those that you'll be familiar with, and they're great for project and to-do management and stuff like that. But they don't let you build your quote and estimate your project and then turn it into a project that has tasks that you can schedule and resource and time track on directly. And they don't let you, because there's no financial element there, or you have to manually, some of them may let you do that, but it's like you build your quote somewhere else, and then you manually have to say, well, this task is going to be like 100 hours at whatever. So there's that manual element, right? So what a true professional services automation tool does is allow you to bring that financial element. So you can see what you've invoiced, how much is left, any purchases you're making, create purchase orders, add the markup. So you're always on top of your data. So I think that's another one. And yeah, so we've got usability, we've got that financial element, and I think for a lot of growing businesses, it's that kind of multi-entity. So whether you have different branches that or different entities in different countries, being able to report on all that in the same place is really fantastic.
Amazing. So that thank you for explaining that. Just one thought that's come to my mind as well. Some people are using CRM systems,
Yeah,
so kind of looking at their new business pipeline.
absolutely.
Is that an add-on, or does that
Mhm.
form part of Scoro?
That is a really, really good question. So, a CRM, it depends on how mature you are with using your CRM. Let's say you're in stage one or stage two of the examples we talked about. You're probably not using a CRM system. So, Scoro lets you build a quote, and it has a pipeline function, so you can track your deal as it goes, right? But for the more mature businesses that have a really smart CRM system, HubSpot or Salesforce or whatever it is, there's an integration. So as you put the initial deal in HubSpot and track it as it moves, there might be a certain stage when it becomes more real and you need to do a proper estimate. And that can sync. And so when you move something through that stage, it suddenly shows up in the system in Scoro, and then you can build your more detailed quote, and then it's you continue that process. So they work kind of hand in hand. But my previous agency didn't use a CRM system, so we used the pipeline feature in Scoro.
Got that. Lovely. Okay. Well,
Hmm.
thank you so much. That was so useful. So let's just reflect on the stages that we've gone through.
Hmm.
First stage was chaotic.
Yeah,
The second stages was glimmer of growth,
yeah,
and then the third one was consolidate.
absolutely.
So
So
let's move to the next stage.
definitely. So now you've got some good tools in place and they're giving you good data, right? So we're ready to move into stage four. And that's what I call the data-driven era. Okay. SBI research calls this institutionalized, which again, I was like, well, that's not very easy to
Very
understand. So
dry.
data-driven makes a lot more sense to me. So you've got really well-defined and mature processes. Everything is documented. Everyone's working consistently. The organization is now proactive in planning for different scenarios, right? So I think this is where I see this stage differ from the previous is that now you're using the data and really leaning into it to leverage and forecast where you're going. So it's not just looking at what did we do last month or how have we done in the past quarter, but it's like, are we going to have resource in the next 3 weeks for this new pitch we're taking on if we win it, or things like that. So you're looking at your utilization, your revenue forecasts, and that kind of thing. So you know when you need to dial up your sales efforts because there's not enough work coming in and your team is going to be sitting there with nothing to do. Or somebody calls you for a pitch and you're like, well, yeah, we could probably do the pitch, but if that really starts in a month, we don't have the resource. So, you're empowered to make the decision. Are we going to bring in freelance resource or are we going to tell the client we can't do this for another 2 months or are we going to decline this? So, becoming that's what data driven is, right? So you're using it to steer where your organization is going. And that I think is a really, really amazing place to be.
It is an amazing place to be. And I'm also kind of furiously thinking about different agencies that I've been speaking to quite recently that have perhaps grown quicker than they
Hmm.
expected. And I think maybe we should talk afterwards because there may be something happening where they're not having that visibility of the
Hmm.
data
Hmm.
adequately enough to determine which resource they need and
Hmm.
by when.
Right.
So I think, yeah, there's probably a different conversation to be had. But this is so useful, really, really useful. I mean, we've talked about Scoro, but if there is another, what other systems
Hmm.
do you find that people agencies usually
Yeah.
use other than Scoro that
On the PSA, professional services automation front, like, two names that come top of mind are Productive. And the other one is Cantata. So those are two other names that come up. One of them, I guess it might be for more kind of, well, maybe I won't share my opinions or likes and dislikes of anything, right? But those are two names that come up, Productive and Cantata. And then some agencies, I think it's a little bit more about the early stages. So no, I hope no one will be offended about me saying that. But things like Monday.com or
Mm.
ClickUp, I see those more as toolkits that let you design what you want to design, right? So you could end up just using it for a to-do list, but it's a toolkit. So the amount of time that, one reason as an ops director, I steered away from it is because like I don't have time to think about how I'm going to design a system. Like that's not my job and my expertise. And
Mm.
if I was doing that, I know there would be massive gaps because I'm not a systems architect and I'm not the finance person and the ops person and it's just not it wasn't for me. So if someone's using that and has managed to get to that stage 3 or 4, like hats off to you. But that's why those were never right for me. Is like I want to get away from using these disjointed tools that don't speak to one another and don't let us work in this multi-entity efficient way. But I also don't want to do something that's completely from scratch and I have to figure out how to create this ecosystem.
It's a really good point, actually. I mean, it's probably a bit of a naive question, really, but for these platforms like Scoro,
Mhm.
do they automatically come with, a consultancy element, like an ops consultant will come in and help you integrate it into the business? Because I can just imagine I'm not a systems person. I
Yeah.
get very overwhelmed by lots
Hmm.
of tech and, buttons and stuff like that.
Yeah,
I'm not stupid, I can do it, but it takes me ages to navigate. It's just not my flow.
totally.
So so I would want, if I was, if you've got a fast growing business
Yeah.
and perhaps you don't have an operations director currently,
Yeah.
or someone with the skill set and the experience,
Hmm.
then it kind of would make sense to me to purchase a system, but also for
Hmm.
someone to come in and help me integrate it and help my team integrate it.
Yeah. I would say, okay, there's two things I would say to that, Jenny. The first point is you do need a champion or maybe two people working together in-house in an agency. I think, when I was bringing in a platform at my agency, I worked hand in hand with our finance director. So it was two of us. And we had to carve out time to work on this together. So you need to ensure, if you're like the MD of an agency listening to this, you give the internal resources the time to think about this. And if you don't have an ops director or finance director, that's fine as well. But you're, head of accounts or whoever's going to be responsible for this, making sure that you appreciate that they're going to need some time to think and you allow them to do that. Okay. So that's the in-house part. On the external part, most of these platforms do have an onboarding program of some kind. So there tends to be two elements. Like at Scoro, for agencies under, for example, a certain size, maybe it's 9 or 10. Um, Off the top of my head, it might be we've got an onboarding step-by-step thing that takes you through. These are all the things you need to do to configure the system. Okay. And if you're larger than that, then you can have an onboarding program. I believe, you know what, even when you're smaller, you can choose to have an onboarding partner. And that's what I had done at the agency. Even though I was working with the finance director, it was somebody like, every 2 weeks they would give us homework. Well, first they would understand our requirements. So they just got a really good understanding of how our business works and understood how we want to sell things and price things and all that kind of stuff. And then we'd get a bit of homework and then we'd meet up, 2 weeks later, present what we've done, or we might have sent it through in between, and then it would be the next set of work. So let's work on this next project and configure that. So by the end of this process, you should be fully configured, and then it's about running training, which they helped us do. And we recorded that, and I had put that in our onboarding materials for new starters. I do have some, if you don't mind me just jumping into a small tangent there as well, just some, I would say if you're bringing in something that worked really, really well for me. First, we recorded this training session, right? And it was for the account managers, project managers, it was 2 3-hour sessions. Okay. And what I said to everyone is don't bring a pen and paper. Do not take notes. This is to give you an understanding end to end. We're just going to take you through the whole thing. A new project comes in and how you're going to check if the client's in the system or create the client, and took them through that, right? So it was just high level. So every new starter was to watch this that was working in a project manager or account management role. And then I ended up in our agency handbook creating really micro how-to topics. Okay, how to check your clients in the system, how to create a new supplier, how to create an invoice using our templates, how to turn that, how to create a quote using templates, how to turn that quote into a project, how to book resource, it ended up, I think we launched with like 20 micro how-to guides. And I recorded video clips. So these were like 2 minutes of me screen sharing, showing people this is what you click and this is how you do it. Okay. And it started with two. By the time I think I left the agency, there was probably 50. And so what that meant is when you're going to work with the new system and you launch it, and understandably, people are going to be anxious and stressed and unhappy about a change. And it was like, don't worry. We've taken the guesswork out of this. You don't need to remember that 3-hour training session, try to figure out, or go watch that video again. You're trying to create a quote, go watch video number 4. It's 2 minutes and it's going to show you exactly what to do. This is how you do a purchase order. This is how you raise an invoice. And Jenny, what ended up happening is best practice. I can't tell you how fantastic compliance to best practice was in our agency. So myself and the finance director were just this was just like one of the things that we were most proud of is that we had extremely fantastic best practice adherence because nobody was learning from their friend that was doing it the wrong way. And when people did do it wrong, it was like, well, can you watch this and fix that? And if you still have troubles, reach out to me and I'll be happy to help you. It just made my life so much easier and it made people feel very secure with the transition. So I would say do that and do it for your agency in the way you want to quote and stuff, because a lot of platforms might have how to general advice in their how to knowledge base about this is how you create a quote, but might not be super relevant to how you do that or any kind of. So doing those 2 to 3 minute videos, I kind of preferred that over written stuff because that turns into this long bullet list of click this and do that. Watching this 2 minute video meant people could just open a little window side by side and just follow the same clicks and execute whatever they were trying to do.
Oh my goodness, that was so useful. And I'm sure lots of people getting ideas to do this. Now I'm going to get super granular. Can you share? Because I actually saw the other day that there is actually a tool that is used for screen kind of grabbing, screen recording, and it all goes into a little handbook.
Hmm.
It was very sort of self-contained, and there's
Yeah.
obviously this screen sharing software as well. So, any tips or advice for any tools that you would recommend?
Yeah. My favorite screen recording tool is called Loom.
Oh, I use
And
Zoom. Yeah.
yeah, it's you can download it for your Mac or PC or just using a browser. I recommend downloading the app so that it's installed on your computer and it
Mm.
lets you record everything, it transcribes everything, and then you can just put a link of it into your agency handbook if you have one online. And then, you can embed all these videos in your how-to page for like whatever it is. So I love Loom. I think the other one that's a little bit more screenshot is called Scribed, if I'm not misremembering that. And so what you do is you kind of hit record and then you go do your action, and it kind of takes key screenshots. And I think it uses some AI to kind of extrapolate what you're doing. And then you can embed that in your how-to resource. I'm a big fan of video, but I think either of those tools works really well.
You know what? I think it was that one. I think it was Scribed that I
Mm,
saw advertised. But Loom is fantastic. I use that myself. So great tips there. Thank you so much, Half. This is brilliant.
absolutely. Hmm.
Do you know the other thing I was going to say? Well, I mean, in terms of AI tools, is Synthesia is
Oh.
something that, yeah, I don't know. I mean, basically, it's a talking head, and you
Hmm.
put in the copy,
Mm.
and someone just appears and
Oh,
says the
cool.
words.
Yeah.
And the benefit of that is that if you change your practices and your processes, you
Yeah.
can go back and just update the copy,
Amazing.
and then they say something different. Because I think you're right. The point about video kind of brings it all to life. I don't think there's anyone that doesn't like video.
Hmm.
So this is brilliant. Okay, great. Anything
That,
else to add to that stage?
no, that was all about becoming data driven and using it to guide your business. So, shall we move into the final stage?
Yes, let's do it.
Okay, so stage five, I call this the platinum era. And so that SPI would call that optimize. So at this stage, we've already established excellent processes, excellent measurement, and continued improvement initiatives being in place. But I think beyond continuous improvement, at this stage, you're actively innovating to improve your customer experience, your value that you're generating, and your loyalty. And I think, Jenny, that's a lot of stuff that you talk about as well. So I think that's what this stage is all about. And it's pretty rare, I think, to get to that stage where you're able to focus on innovation because your ways of working are best in class. You're data driven. You're doing the continuous improvement, and now you're ready to really just focus on innovating and being, leaps and bounds ahead of the competition.
This is excellent. Okay, so we've talked through all of those stages. Thank you
Hmm.
so much, Harv.
Hmm.
I mean, you've worked with an awful lot of agencies in your
Hmm.
time. Would you be able to point to kind of what level you mostly find that
Mm,
people, when perhaps when they invite an operations consultant in,
mm,
at what
hmm.
stage do you usually find they're at?
I, so Jenny, like a few months ago, I did a webinar where I was talking about business maturity, and we ended up doing a survey of the audience to say which stage most resonates with you. I was surprised because this was one of those bigger agency kind of events that I think is like, one of the more mature. perhaps larger agencies and things like that. The majority of people said stage one or stage two, and I was super surprised by that. According to SPI, chaotic stage one is 30% of all businesses. All service-based businesses are 30%. Okay. Stage two, that's a glimmer of growth, is 25%. Okay. Stage three, consolidated, is 25%. Data driven is just 15%. And the platinum era, so that's where the real innovation takes place, is just 5%. So stage one and two make up 55% of all service-based businesses. That's huge. So there's a huge amount of potential that we all have to, work on our ways of working in our operations.
Mm, wow. I mean, so much opportunity to make a big difference. I mean,
Absolutely.
what would you say to an agency listening that perhaps says, "Yep, I'm I'm still in kind of chaotic or glimmer
Hmm.
of growth." You know, what's the starting point, would you
Hmm.
say, to shifting them out of it?
Hmm. I think you should strive to get to stage three as quickly as possible. Until you're there, you really don't have good insight into how you're performing, right? So that should be our goal. Let's get to stage three as quick as possible. And I think clear roles and responsibilities and a leadership structure is really key to that. At a smaller agency, I think everyone ends up juggling too many roles. You're kind of the marketing person on the side, or you're responsible for HR on the side, or performance reviews. I've been there. I was digital director, but I was like, okay, I'm reinventing the performance review process because this is like just not in a good state. So that works for a while. But as you grow and your projects grow and the size of the projects grow and things like that, Jenny, like you get to a size of your agency where that starts being really stressful and it just doesn't work any longer. Like people just can't focus on what they're supposed to be doing, and it's like pulling their hair out. So it feels like the pipe is just about to burst. So I've been there, and then everyone is moaning. Even the senior level team members are kind of just really frustrated with management. So I think making sure that you get out of this frame of mind, sorry, where you think that an ops person or a finance person really, oh, we're years away from that. The sooner you start thinking about just not having billable resource that are working on projects, but also internal focused resources that are helping you get your foundations right and make sure the machine is running efficiently, the better. So that I think is super super important. There's loads of other things I was thinking about, so we can go into that, but I think that's the most important.
I think that's really useful as well. Like it's kind of like, where do I start with this? And you're right,
Hmm.
roles and responsibilities. And I mean, do you have an exercise that you do? I mean, I'm just thinking about an exercise that I did years and years ago where we kind of mapped out the roles that we thought we needed
Hmm.
and then started hiring against them, because
Hmm.
you're right, everyone's wearing multiple hats. So
Yeah.
do you have like key roles that you would say, I think your recommendation to have an ops person that's
Hmm.
non-billable, that's going
Hmm.
to kind of lead the charge for you
Hmm.
while you're all managing the clients and managing your new business pipeline.
Hmm.
That kind of seems super relevant.
Hmm.
Probably another a finance person that's going to
Hmm.
take on, but anything else that you think would be missing at that kind of key stage of trying to get yourself out of chaos?
Yeah, I think looking at you know, it tends to be that delivery is better staffed because you've already got the account managers, and whether that's a hybrid role, account managers that's responsible also for project management, or you've got, project managers or producers that work alongside the account managers, and then you have the resources, whether they're copywriters, designers, developers, whatever it is. That side of things, I think we tend to have a better handle on in this kind of situation. And like I said, it's those internal process and best practice kind of roles, reporting and finance, that there's gaps on, right? So I think certainly ops is important to get a handle on, and finance, but ensuring that the MD has a strong management, a senior level management team that they can also delegate to, that are responsible for heading up the accounts team or the sales team. you know?
Mm.
So kind of practice level leaders that are responsible and they can report into the MD on how their department's running. So I think that's where I would say is important. Using kind of that RACI model to figure out who is responsible, accountable, consulted, informed for each. That helps you really figure out, you know, who's going to do this thing and figure out where the gaps are, like you said, for hiring. But also, it's a great once you get that, that feeds into your better job description. So when you're looking to hire, you've got those ready to go. So you've knocked off something by going through this process. And number two, you can use those job descriptions for your performance review process as well to remind yourself this is what this person is supposed to be working on. Are they doing those things? Even like if you wanted to have a rating scale against each of those bullet points and saying, well, this person was supposed to be doing that. You know, out of five, how are they doing? So I think it just feeds into so much. So getting that process going and making sure you know who's going to do what helps you spot the gaps and measure performance.
Amazing. Harv, thank you so much for sharing. I'm just conscious of time, but I've got
Hmm.
another big question to ask you.
Hmm.
You are at the forefront of operations and consultancy. So I'm really interested in hearing your thoughts on what's happening. Like, what trends are you seeing? What
Hmm.
future trends are you seeing
Hmm.
that you think agencies need to be aware of?
Hmm.
And particularly as it relates to the impact on operations and how we're working.
Hmm. So, Jenny, like it's hard to believe that it's been I think, over 4 years since the whole COVID thing started, right? And so it feels like it feels like not too distant and very distant at the same time. But the whole remote working thing, you know, we've talked about this a lot, but I think it's just important for us to confront that remote working mind frame. I think there's still a lot of grumbling about this, and I think we just need to kind of embrace it and say, how are we going to make this work for company culture and operations so it works as best as possible? And it is possible to make all of those things work really, really efficiently. So I think the future is absolutely flexible. I don't. I do think, you know, there are some downsides to not seeing your colleagues. It slows down your learning process when you're not sitting there, and it slows down the process of building relationships and things like that. I totally get it, but we can't just turn a blind eye to that and just say we're going to resist this and you need to come in 4 days a week or whatever it is. I just don't think that's really likely to work any longer. So thinking about remote first and making sure all those processes are in place to make sure, again, you can work super efficiently and you are doing those things to build culture despite the remote element.
Mm.
So people feel passionate about the mission and involved and stuff like that. The other one, of course, is AI. You know, I think some of the excitement and enthusiasm that we had 12 or 15 months ago has tapered down a little bit because we've used the chat GPTs and the other tools and know what we like. And some of it was maybe overblown and stuff like that. But I think the real work is being done now by loads of companies on creating things that are really going to be valuable for us. So just I think you really need to encourage your teams to be using those tools and experimenting so they're not falling behind. And you know, they've kind of exercised their thinking in this new era of how to ask the right questions or get the right kind of content and ideas being generated and stuff like that with these tools so that when new things come out they're ready to go and they're happy to be continuing to experiment.
I'd like to just dive into that a little bit with you because
Hmm.
you are in operations. And
Hmm.
I think most agencies are kind of future focused anyway. So we're usually embracing new trends and
Hmm.
AI. I know that so many people have been
Hmm.
testing it, like you say. But I keep hearing that there's this kind of where we're at right now with it, there's still a big question mark over data security,
Hmm.
copyright
Hmm.
infringement,
Totally.
security.
Hmm.
Do you know of any agencies that are perhaps doing that safely and
Hmm.
or you know, I had a guest, Sharon Torrick, who is a legal expert in
Hmm.
AI.
Hmm.
And she was talking about having AI policies in place,
Mm.
making sure that you're fully covered legally
Yeah.
when using these types of tools. Because, you know, let's suppose you have someone that's perhaps less experienced, starts using tools and perhaps inadvertently feeds in some information that they've got
Hmm.
from a client
Hmm.
about a new product launch, which
Yeah.
is totally sort of against the rules. Do you have any viewpoint
Hmm.
on where we're at with
Yeah.
AI and any kind of guidance?
I think again, it comes down to that in-house training and your agency handbook, and your in-house training at those all hands and those kinds of events where you introduce a topic. So, where we were talking about time sheeting and how to sell that in, it's the same kind of thing. You need to have a serious moment where you talk about the implications of something and not just hope for the best, right? So, getting everyone together and say, these are the kinds of tools we want to experiment with, but we have created this document that has these do's and don'ts, right? So, don't feed in confidential client information, or you need to maybe anonymize that. But again, if it's super sensitive information, financial metrics and stuff, don't put that in there. And so I think so everyone has that reference. But yeah, one of the big things is copyright, right? And I think it's less of a concern when you're kind of obviously generating ideas and just using it to ideate and things like that, and even for copy. Whereas when it's when you're generating images, I think that is where a big concern comes up, where it's like, what images has it been trained on? And is if you generate some kind of concept for your pitch and your client ends up loving it, and you end up like rolling something out, could somebody come back and say, hey, you've taken, that was my art style that you've kind of stolen, so there's a massive gray area there. I think there are tools out there that kind of try to mitigate this. For example, Adobe's Firefly, if I'm not mistaken, is trained on its own stock image library, unlike Midjourney, so that when you use Firefly, because it's using Adobe stock, you avoid that whole question, but then there might be questions about which one you like the style of, one or the other. But there's probably ways around that you can manage if you're trying to generate content in that way. But yeah, you're totally right. Until there's much more clear laws or legal precedents, it continues to be a bit of a gray area. But I think not avoiding it and seeing if there's other uses of that technology that we can use today. And maybe it's okay to use those tools for ideating for a pitch, but when it comes to execution, you'll start adding your own flavor to that and things like that.
It's great advice. Thank you so much. I mean, for account managers listening, I also think it's a fantastic tool to save you time when you're looking at just client competitive
Hmm.
environment, for example, and what's already out there in the public domain
Yeah,
that you can kind of quickly get to grips with. So, downloading a profit and loss account that's publicly available on your client's website, and then just asking the AI tools to summarize it for you, which is one of the kind of safe ways to use it.
absolutely.
Harv, thank you so much. This has been really useful. I've made
You're welcome.
tons of notes as you've talked, so I've learned a lot today. And I'm curious to know, from your perspective, who would you like to be contacted by,
Hmm.
and what's the best way to reach you? If
Well,
someone's listening and they would like to know more.
absolutely. So if you're interested in agency ops and that whole thing about maturity and loads of different kind of ideas on how to get your agency to improve the way they're working, then of course, Jenny, thank you for mentioning the Handbook, the Agency Operations podcast earlier. So please do subscribe there. And of course, Jenny, you've been a recent guest there as well, talking to our audience. So that's one place to hear conversations. The other is if you're recognizing, the way you're working is quite chaotic and you need to consolidate, and these ideas about streamlining your tools and processes, I'd be very happy to speak to anybody on LinkedIn about what I did. So some of the things that we did when I was moving to a PSA platform from the ad hoc kind of stage to a consolidated stage, how we documented things, how we trained people and stuff like that, and the kinds of things I would say to look for when you're moving to a PSA platform when you're assessing which one to use. Um, And so, yeah, please do reach out to me on LinkedIn. It's linkedin.com/in/Harv Nagra. And I'd be very happy to speak to you and talk to you about my experiences with Scoro as well, if anyone's interested.
Amazing, Harv. We'll put all that link into the show notes. So once again, thank you so much for coming.
Thank you. Thank you for having me, Jenny. I'll speak to you soon.